Welcome to Revise and Resubmit, Weekend Classics. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita. So today, we've got this really interesting piece looking at how researchers, specifically in management studies, actually come up with their research questions. And it proposes, well, maybe a more powerful way to get to those really big, impactful ideas.
Yeah, the argument is kind of striking, isn't it? That the way things are usually done might actually be holding the field back a bit.
Right. So what's the main source we're digging into here?
It's a 2011 article from the Academy of Management Review. The title is Generating Research Questions Through Problematization.
Okay.
And it's by Alvesson and Jörgen Sandberg. Alvesson's at Lund University and University of Queensland. Sandberg's also at Queensland. These are folks who really study the mechanics of research itself.
Got it. And they kick things off with a pretty big idea, right? About influential theories.
They do. They basically say that the theories that really make a difference, the ones that change how we think about something, well, they often work by challenging the stuff we just assumed was true.
Challenging assumptions. Okay, so what's the standard approach they're looking at? The one they think might be limiting?
They call it gap spotting. That's the term they use for the really common way research questions get generated.
Gap spotting, okay.
Yeah, it's basically about finding or sometimes even constructing these gaps in the existing research. Areas that haven't been studied enough, questions nobody's quite answered yet.
Things that are missing.
Exactly. And then the research aims to, fill that gap.
Like finding a missing puzzle piece. Makes sense. What kind of language do researchers use when they're doing this gap spotting?
Oh, you see it all the time if you read academic papers. Phrases like, this study extends the literature, or we address a critical gap. Maybe this area has been overlooked.
Further research is needed.
That's a classic one, yeah. It's all about framing your work as the next logical step, filling in something that was incomplete.
And this isn't just their feeling, right? They point to some evidence for how common this is.
Oh yeah, definitely. They reference a key study from back in '97 by Locke and Goldenbittle.
Okay.
They looked at top journals, ASQ and AMJ, and found that, almost all the articles they looked at justified themselves by pointing out some kind of gap, something missing, something incomplete in what came before.
Wow, almost all of them.
Yeah, something like 80 out of 82 articles. It was overwhelmingly the dominant way people framed their contribution.
And Alvesson and Sandberg confirmed this is broader than just those two journals?
They did. Their own look in the 2011 paper covered more journals, different types of research, to qualitative, quantitative, inductive, deductive.
And found the same thing.
Pretty much. Across the board, the main way researchers set up their questions was by identifying and promising to fill these gaps. Whether it was, conflicting findings, neglected topics, missing theories, it was all about the gaps.
So researchers are sort of actively building these gaps sometimes. It's not always obvious.
That's a good way to put it. Sometimes they synthesize different streams of research that hadn't been connected before to sort of reveal a gap at the intersection.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, or they might point out inconsistencies. It can involve some creativity constructing that gap. It's not always just lying there waiting to be found.
And I guess these gaps can be big or small.
For sure. Some are narrow, very specific additions. Others might be bigger, suggesting adjustments to existing theories. But the key thing, Alvesson and Sandberg argue, is that even the bigger gaps usually don't question the fundamental assumptions underneath the existing theories.
That seems like the critical point they're making.
It really is.
And even when research is supposed to be more exploratory, like qualitative work, this gap spotting still seems to be the default.
Yeah, that might be surprising. But they cite other studies, reviews by Lee and others, Bloom and others. Also work by Colquhoun, the Podophyllin, looking at AMJ.
Yeah.
And they all suggest that even inductive research often ends up sort of fitting into existing frameworks, maybe testing known ideas in new contexts or adding a variable, but not usually challenging the core structure.
And the journals themselves, the editors, they seem to reinforce this.
It seems so. They mention editorial advice from AMJ and ASQ telling authors pretty directly, you need to show us the gap, tell us why it's important to fill it.
So the whole system kind of encourages this approach.
That's certainly the implication.
Okay, so why? Why is gap spotting so dominant? What's driving it?
Well, they suggest a couple things. One is probably rhetorical. Framing your work as building on what's accepted, filling a gap. It just makes it easier to get published. It feels less risky, more incremental.
Less likely to get shot down by reviewers, maybe?
Possibly. Starbuck wrote about this, how innovations are often framed as just enhancements to make them more palatable.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Yeah, the whole structure of academic careers, tenure, promotion, grants.
Yeah.
It often relies on steady publication in top journals.
Right.
And challenging fundamental assumptions. Well, that can be seen as risky. It might upset people, lead to rejection. Bourdieu and Starbuck talked about these kinds of pressures. Gap spotting feels safer.
So we want breakthroughs, but the system might favor playing it safe.
That's the tension, yeah. But Alvesson and Sandberg also make the point that, look, whatever the behind-the-scenes reasons, what gets written in the paper as the research question matters. That's the contribution the authors are claiming.
You have to take it at face value.
Right. If work is challenging assumptions, it needs to actually say so to have that impact.
And it sounds like there's been growing unease about this reliance on gap spotting within the field itself. It's not just Alvesson and Sandberg.
No, not at all. They point to editorials going back decades, actually. Daft and Lewin in Organization Science back in 1990 were already worried about too much footnote-on-footnote research.
Wow, 1990.
Yeah, and they repeated the concern later. Others in Journal of Management Studies, AMJ, there's been this recurring theme.
What's the core worry? That we're getting more papers, but not necessarily more interesting ideas.
That's pretty much it. Clark and Wright, former editors at JMS, noted exactly that submissions were up, but truly significant papers weren't necessarily increasing at the same rate. There's this idea, maybe floated by Sutton and Staw too, that the field has become really strong on rigor, on methods.
Which is good, right?
Absolutely essential. But maybe that focus has come at the expense of generating really interesting, novel, influential theories. We're good at testing, maybe less good at groundbreaking conceptualizing.
Okay, so that perfectly sets up the need for an alternative, which brings us to their proposal. Yeah. Problematization. What exactly is that?
So problematization, the way they define it, is a method focused specifically on identifying and then challenging the assumptions that underlie the existing theories.
Yeah, not the gaps, but the foundations.
Exactly. The goal is to formulate research questions that come from questioning those foundations, which they argue has more potential to lead to really influential new theories.
So it's a much more critical engagement with the literature.
More critical of the assumptions, yes. They're careful to say it's not totally separate from gap spotting. Any critical reading might spot gaps, but the primary aim is different. Problematization deliberately targets the assumptions. Gap spotting usually works within them.
And they also draw a line between this and some other critical approaches like postmodernism.
Right. They acknowledge that fields like critical theory or postmodernism are obviously very focused on critique, but they see their problematization methodology as distinct. It's not about applying a sort of prepackaged critique or just deconstructing things.
It's about building something new afterwards.
That's the idea. It's about challenging assumptions as a way to generate new research questions and hopefully new, more insightful theories. Not just critique for critique's sake.
And a key part you mentioned is challenging your own assumptions too.
Yes, that's crucial. They stress that. It's not just about critiquing others. It's about becoming aware of your own theoretical baggage, the things you take for granted.
Because you often don't realize you're making assumptions.
Exactly. They quote Slife and Williams on this. You need a point of comparison to even see your own implicit ideas as assumptions, rather than just reality or common sense.
So it's a more reflective process for the researcher.
Very much so. The goal is this kind of dialectical process, questioning your own stance, other perspectives, the literature, to try and surface genuinely novel questions. They suggest using tools from broader critical traditions, linguistic analysis, constructionism, political theory, to help scrutinize assumptions.
But it's not tied to any one of those specific theories.
No, they argue the methodology itself is agnostic. It rests on the broader idea that knowledge is provisional, and progress often comes from rethinking fundamentals, like Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts, or work by Sukas and Knudsen.
Okay, then they define theory broadly too, right?
Yeah, they use Bacharach's definition, basically. A theory links concepts, but always within a specific set of assumptions and boundaries. The key is realizing those assumptions aren't just context. They're fundamental to the theory itself.
So understanding assumptions is key to developing new theory, not just using existing ones.
Precisely. And they connect this to Foucault's idea of problematization.
How so?
Foucault saw problematization as trying to figure out how and to what extent it might be possible to think differently. It's about questioning the necessary starting points, the presuppositions researchers make.
The things you have to assume to even start thinking about a topic in a certain way.
Exactly. Gadamer called these assumptions the starting points for knowledge. So Alvesson and Sandberg's method puts illuminating and challenging those assumptions right at the center.
Yeah, they also connect this to Murray Davis's work on what makes theories interesting.
Right. Davis famously argued that interesting theories are ones that challenge the audience's assumptions. His Index of the Interesting lays out different ways the assumptions can be challenged about single things, about relationships between things.
But Alvesson and Sandberg felt Davis didn't go quite far enough.
Yeah, they argued Davis tells us that challenging assumptions is interesting, but he doesn't really specify the different kinds of assumptions you might challenge. Their methodology aims to provide a more concrete framework for how to do that.
Which leads to their typology of assumptions, these different levels we can question.
Exactly. They propose 5 broad types, kind of ranging in scope and depth.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first type?
First are in-house assumptions. These are the beliefs shared within a specific school of thought, like a particular research tradition.
So assumptions specific to one group.
Pretty much. Their example is like, in traditional leadership studies, assuming leadership is mostly about the leader's traits. Challenging that saying context is more important would be questioning an in-house assumption.
Okay, makes sense. What's next?
Root metaphor assumptions. These are broader, more fundamental images or metaphors we use to understand a subject. Think about the common idea of organizations as cultures.
Right.
That often carries assumptions of unity, shared values, maybe uniqueness. Questioning those ideas, emphasizing maybe fragmentation or ambiguity in cultures, challenges the root metaphor. It's about the core lens.
So a deeper level than the in-house ones.
Generally, yeah. Then you get to paradigm assumptions. These are the really big ones about the nature of reality, ontology, how we know things, epistemology, and how we should study them.
Methodology, like the philosophical foundations of a field.
Exactly. Sandberg's own work, questioning the separation of person and work in studies of competence, arguing they're intertwined, is an example of tackling a paradigm assumption.
Okay, getting pretty fundamental now.
Definitely. Fourth are ideology assumptions. These involve the political, moral, maybe gendered assumptions baked into theories.
Like hidden values.
Kind of. Burwell's classic study, questioning why we assume workers resist effort. Instead of asking why they work as hard as they do, that challenged an ideological assumption about labor. Seaver's questioning if people always need external motivation is another example.
Uncovering the political or moral leanings.
Hey.
And the last one.
Field assumptions. These are the really broad ones, often shared across different schools of thought, maybe even across related disciplines.
Things almost everyone takes for granted.
Yeah. Herbert Simon's idea of bounded rationality challenged the field assumption, dominant in economics for a long time, that humans are perfectly rational actors. Or the shared assumption in much management research that management itself is a distinct, stable category to be studied or critiqued.
So that's the whole range, from specific schools to the entire field.
Right. They see it as a spectrum. And they note that while challenging the big field assumption seems splashy, sometimes a really insightful challenge to an in-house assumption can be just as impactful for developing new theory. It's not just about scope.
Okay, so we have these types of assumptions. How do they suggest researchers actually do the problematizing? They have methodological principles, right?
They do. 6 of them. Framing it as this structured process of questioning. First is identifying a domain of literature.
Okay.
But interestingly, it's not about doing a huge, exhaustive literature review like you might for gap spotting. It's more about selecting key texts, maybe the foundational works, major reviews, really influential recent pieces, and reading them deeply, specifically looking for assumptions.
Depth over breadth.
Exactly. Second principle, identifying and articulating assumptions. This is the core, making the implicit explicit. As Goldner said, our deepest assumptions are often invisible to us.
So how do you make them visible?
They suggest different tactics for different types, like scrutinize debates within a school for in-house assumptions, identify the core metaphors for root metaphor assumptions, engage with totally different worldviews for paradigm assumptions, think about power and interests for ideology assumptions, look for common ground across schools for field assumptions. It's investigative work.
Trying to see what's being taken for granted. Okay, what's third?
Evaluating articulated assumptions. Once you've identified some, you need to decide which ones are actually worth challenging. Not all assumptions are created equal or equally problematic.
How do you evaluate them?
You ask, is this assumption really central? Does questioning it have potential to generate new insights? Is it maybe outdated? Is it empirically questionable? Does challenging it seem theoretically fruitful, novel, provocative?
Yeah.
Timing matters too.
So be strategic about which assumptions to target.
Right. Then, fourth principle, developing an alternative assumption ground. This flows from the critique. If you question an assumption, what do you propose instead?
The counter assumption.
Yes, but they stress it's not just about finding the simple opposite. It involves looking at critical literature, maybe competing theories, using analytical tools, but really trying to creatively construct a new foundation through that dialectical process, rethinking the basis.
Okay. Principle 5.
Considering assumptions in relation to the audience. This is crucial. Who holds the assumptions you're challenging? What's their perspective? Challenging assumptions isn't purely intellectual, it's social and political too.
You need to anticipate reactions.
Exactly. How might different groups, reviewers, colleagues, practitioners respond? Will they resist? They suggest challenging in-house or root metaphor assumptions might be assumptions, for example.
Understand the politics of ideas.
Right.
Got it. And the last principle.
Sixth, evaluating the alternative assumption ground. How do you know if your new set of assumptions is any good? They come back to Davis, the ultimate test is the "that's interesting" reaction.
Not "that's obvious" or "that's absurd."
Precisely. Those are signs of failure. The alternative needs to feel potentially fruitful, relevant, persuasive. They also mention things like politeness in how you present the challenge, even aesthetics. Does the new perspective offer a compelling way to see the world?
So it's quite a comprehensive process, and they use an example to show how it works in practice.
Yes, they apply these principles to that 1994 article by Dutton, Dukrich, and Harquail on organizational identification, the one about how our image of an organization shapes our connection to it.
The 3M salesman example they mentioned.
That's the one. So they walk through how you might problematize that specific influential study.
Okay, let's hit some highlights. How did they identify assumptions in the Dutton study?
Well, applying Principle 2, they pointed out things like the assumption that people naturally see themselves as members, holding shared beliefs about the organization's core traits, its distinctiveness, centrality, endurance.
Things Dutton and colleagues maybe took for granted.
Probably, yeah. They also highlighted the deeper assumption that individuals and organizations are stable entities with comparable attributes, and even the ontological assumption that they exist separately. They then compared these to related work, noting overlaps and differences, and categorized them using their typology, in-house, paradigm, etc.
And then evaluating those assumptions. Principle 3.
Right. They started questioning them. Like, is the idea of the loyal organization man still relevant? Is the link always positive? Are organizations really that stable and coherent? Do people really have fixed attributes that neatly align with organizational ones? They suggested reality might be more fluid, fragmented, context-dependent.
Challenging the tidiness of the original model.
Exactly. Which led them to Principle 4, developing alternatives.
Where did they draw inspiration from?
They brought in ideas from critical theory. Maybe identification isn't always good. Maybe it's fragile in modern work. They considered economic views. Maybe identification is just self-interest. And post-structuralist ideas challenging the whole notion of a single stable identity for either person or organization.
Suggesting a messier picture.
Yeah, like maybe thinking of person and organization as just different streams of stories that only sometimes overlap. This led to ideas like identification being temporary, strategic, context-specific.
And this generated different research questions.
Absolutely. Questions like, how temporary is identification? Under what conditions does it feel stable? Do people hold contradictory beliefs about their organization? How does that work? What about moving away from identification, de-identification?
Much more dynamic questions.
Yes. And then they considered the audience, Principle 5, acknowledging the huge literature on identity and how different groups might react. Some finding it irrelevant, others finding it insightful.
And finally, evaluating the alternative, Principle 6. Did they think it would be interesting?
They argued that yes, while their alternatives questioned the original study, they didn't completely dismiss the topic or the cognitive angle. So, likely interesting to many in the field. Maybe obvious to radical constructionists, but interesting to the mainstream. They felt these questions offered more potential than just finding minor gaps in the original Dutton framework.
So it's a powerful illustration of the method. When should researchers actually use this? Is it always better than gap spotting?
They're careful not to say that. Gap spotting has its place, clarifying things, building incrementally, and they warn against perpetual problematization where you just question everything constantly and never build anything.
Right. That sounds exhausting.
It can be. But their main point is, given how dominant gap spotting is now, there's probably a lot more room and need for problematization, especially in areas where one way of thinking has become really entrenched.
Where challenging assumptions might be particularly valuable.
Exactly.
This has been fascinating. Really makes you think about how research actually happens. So, summing up, one of the biggest takeaways for our listener from Alvesson and Sandberg.
I think there are two main things. First, just recognizing gap spotting for what it is, the default mode, and understanding its potential limitations for generating really breakthrough ideas. They basically problematize gap spotting itself.
Right, seeing it as a field assumption almost.
Yeah. And second, understanding their proposed alternative, the problematization methodology. It's a structured way to challenge assumptions, not just critique, but to generate new, potentially more interesting research questions.
Based on that typology of assumptions and the 6 principles for working through them.
Exactly. It's systematic, but it clearly requires creativity too, reflection, broad reading. It's really an extension of Davis's insight about challenging assumptions, but made much more concrete and actionable for researchers.
So ultimately, it's about encouraging a more reflective, maybe more ambitious kind of scholarship.
I think that's the hope, that it offers a way to move beyond incrementalism and generate theories that are not just rigorous, but also truly interesting and influential.
A really valuable perspective. Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to take away from this deep dive. Consider your own field, or just areas you follow closely. What are the foundational assumptions everyone seems to accept?
Yeah, are they being actively questioned? Or is most of the energy going into filling in the details within those assumptions?
What might you see differently if you started deliberately questioning those core ideas? Something to think about.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.
সুধী শ্রোতা, রিভাইজ অ্যান্ড রিসাবমিটের উইকেন্ড ক্লাসিক্স পর্বে আপনাদের স্বাগত। আমি পাভলাভ।
আর আমি নিকিতা।
যুগান্তকারী চিন্তা বা গবেষণা, আচ্ছা এগুলো ঠিক কিভাবে জন্মায়? মানে আমরা তো প্রায়ই দেখি যে নতুন কাজগুলো আসলে আগের গবেষণার খালি জায়গাগুলো ভরাট করার চেষ্টা করে।
হ্যাঁ, গ্যাপগুলো ফিল করার চেষ্টা।
ঠিক, কিন্তু আসলেই কি বড় পরিবর্তনগুলো, মানে আইডিয়ার মোড় ঘোরানো ব্যাপারগুলো ওভাবে আসে, নাকি এর পেছনে অন্য কোনো প্রক্রিয়া আছে?
এটা খুব ভালো একটা প্রশ্ন। কিন্তু
এই ব্যাপারটা নিয়েই ভাবছিলাম। ম্যাটস অ্যালভেসন আর ইয়র্গেন সেইনবার্গের একটা লেখা পড়লাম। বিষয় হলো প্রবলেমাইজেশন, মানে সমস্যায়নের মাধ্যমে গবেষণার প্রশ্ন তৈরি করা।
ওহ, অ্যালভেসন আর স্যান্ডবার্গ, হ্যাঁ, তাদের কাজটা খুব গুরুত্বপূর্ণ।
তো আজ আমরা ভাবলাম এই ধারণাটা নিয়ে একটু কথা বলা যাক। মানে শুধু একাডেমিক পদ্ধতি হিসেবে নয়, বরং নতুন কিছু ভাবার একটা উপায় হিসেবে আর কি।
ঠিক, একদম।
আমাদের আজকের আলোচনার লক্ষ্য হলো এই যে গবেষণার প্রশ্ন বা যে কোনো সমস্যার গভীরে যাওয়ার একটা অন্যরকম পথের খোঁজ করা, যা শুধু ফাঁক খোঁজার বাইরে গিয়ে আমাদের চিন্তাকে একটু ধাক্কা দেয়। ডেভিস যেমন বলেছিলেন না, যে সেই তত্ত্বই আকর্ষণীয় যা আমাদের সাধারণ ধারণাকে চ্যালেঞ্জ করে।
হ্যাঁ, মনে পড়ছে, খুবই সত্যি কথা।
চলুন তাহলে এই বিষয়টা নিয়ে একটু গভীরে যাই।
অবশ্যই।
তো যেটা বলছিলাম, গবেষণার জগতে প্রশ্ন তৈরির একটা খুব পরিচিত উপায় হলো গ্যাপ স্পটিং, মানে খালি জায়গা খুঁজে বের করা।
হ্যাঁ, গ্যাপ খোঁজা, লিটারেচারে কোথায় ফাঁক আছে।
একদম। আগের কাজগুলোতে কোথায় ঘাটতি, কোন প্রশ্নের উত্তর দেয়া হয়নি, সেটা খুঁজে বের করে সেই শূন্যস্থান পূরণ করা। প্রায় তো দেখা যায় পেপারে লেখা থাকে, এই বিষয়ে আরও গবেষণা প্রয়োজন বা এই তত্ত্বকে আরও এগিয়ে নিতে, এই ধরনের কথা।
হ্যাঁ, এই অ্যাপ্রোচটা খুব কমন, আর এর কারণও আছে। এটা অনেকটা নিরাপদ, সেফ খেলা আর কি।
নিরাপদ কিভাবে?
কারণ এটা পরিচিত পথে হাঁটা, আগের কাজের ওপর ভিত্তি করে ছোট ছোট ধাপ এগোনো। আর সত্যি বলতে এর ফলে গবেষণাপত্র প্রকাশ করাও তুলনামূলকভাবে সহজ হয়ে যায়।
আচ্ছা।
কিন্তু এর একটা বড় দুর্বলতাও আছে, এটা প্রায়শই গতানুগতিক বা খুব সামান্য নতুনত্ব আনে, খুব ইনক্রিমেন্টাল হয় রেজাল্টগুলো।
খুব বড় কোনো পরিবর্তন আনে না।
ঠিক, এটা বিদ্যমান জ্ঞান বা তত্ত্বের দেওয়ালগুলোকেই আরও একটু মজবুত করে, কিন্তু নতুন কোনো দরজা খুলে দেয় না। অনেক জার্নাল সম্পাদকও আজকাল বলছেন যে এই অতিরিক্ত গ্যাপ স্পটিংয়ের ফলে সত্যিই যুগান্তকারী বা খেলা ঘুরিয়ে দেওয়ার মতো গবেষণা কমে যাচ্ছে।
ও ইন্টারেস্টিং। তো ঠিক এখানেই আসছে বিকল্প পদ্ধতিটা, তাই তো? এই প্রবলেমাটাইজেশন বা সমস্যায়ন।
একদম, প্রবলেমাটাইজেশন
শব্দটা একটু কঠিন শোনায় বটে, এর মূল ধারণাটা আসলে কি?
এর মানে হলো কোনো বিষয়ে আমরা যা কিছু প্রায় স্বতঃসিদ্ধ বা নিশ্চিত বলে ধরি নিই,
অ্যাজাম্পশন।
হ্যাঁ, অ্যাজাম্পশন, সেই ভিত্তি বা অ্যাজাম্পশনগুলোকেই প্রশ্নবিদ্ধ করা, চ্যালেঞ্জ করা।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, তার মানে শুধু কি জানি না সেটা খোঁজা নয়।
না, শুধু সেটা নয়, বরং যা জানি সেটা কি আসলেই ঠিক, অন্যভাবে ভাবা যায় না, এই প্রশ্ন তোলা। ধরুন, আমরা হয়তো কোনো একটা তত্ত্বকে বেদ বাক্য বলে মেনে নিয়েছি। প্রবলেমাটাইজেশন সেই তত্ত্বের একদম গোড়ার অ্যাজাম্পশনগুলোকে প্রশ্ন করবে।
বাহ।
এর আসল সৌন্দর্যটা হলো এই যে প্রতিষ্ঠিত জ্ঞান বা চিন্তার কাঠামো, সেটাকে একটা ঝাঁকুনি দেওয়া, অনেকটা পুরনো বাড়ির ভিত নাড়িয়ে দেখার মতো, শুধু দেয়ালের ফাটল সারানো নয়।
দারুণ উপমা তো। তার মানে কেবল শূন্যস্থান পূরণ নয়, একেবারে ধারণার গোড়া ধরে নাড়া দেওয়া।
ঠিক তাই।
আলভেসন ও স্যান্ডবার্গ কি এরকম কোনো উদাহরণ দিয়েছেন? মানে কোন ধরনের অ্যাজাম্পশন চ্যালেঞ্জ করা যেতে পারে?
হ্যাঁ, তারা বিভিন্ন স্তরের অনুমানের কথা বলেছেন। ধরুন, কোনো নির্দিষ্ট তত্ত্বের ভেতরের খুঁটিনাটি অনুমান হতে পারে, অথবা পুরো একটা জ্ঞানের শাখার মূল ভিত্তি, তার দর্শন, যাকে হয়তো প্যারাডাইম বা মূল রূপক বলা যায়।
একটা উদাহরণ দিলে ভালো হয়।
আচ্ছা, যেমন ধরুন, কর্মক্ষেত্রে মোটিভেশন নিয়ে ভাবা যাক। সাধারণ প্রশ্ন কি হয়, কিভাবে কর্মীদের আরও মোটিভেট করা যায়, তাই না?
হ্যাঁ, এটাই তো সাধারণ প্রশ্ন।
কিন্তু প্রবলেমাটাইজেশন হয়তো প্রশ্ন করবে, আচ্ছা, কর্মীদের বাইরে থেকে মোটিভেট করার দরকারটাই বা পড়ছে কেন? তাদের কাজটাই কি যথেষ্ট অর্থপূর্ণ বা আকর্ষণীয় নয়?
ওহ, দেখুন প্রশ্নটা কিভাবে পুরো ধারণার মোড় ঘুরিয়ে দিল। এটা তো একদম অন্যরকম ভাবনা।
ঠিক, এটাই হলো অ্যাজাম্পশনকে চ্যালেঞ্জ করা। এখানে অ্যাজাম্পশনটা ছিল যে কর্মীদের মোটিভেট করতে হয়, কিন্তু প্রশ্নটা হলো কেন করতে হয়।
বুঝলাম। আচ্ছা, এই সমস্যায়নের কি কোনো নির্দিষ্ট প্রক্রিয়া আছে? মানে কিভাবে এটা করা যেতে পারে?
হ্যাঁ, তারা একটা কাঠামোর মতো প্রস্তাব করেছেন। খুব যে ধরাবাঁধা নিয়ম তা নয়, তবে কয়েকটা ধাপের কথা বলা আছে। যেমন, প্রথমে বোঝা দরকার আমরা কোন জ্ঞানের ক্ষেত্র বা সাহিত্য নিয়ে কথা বলছি।
ঠিক।
তারপর সেই ক্ষেত্রে কোন কোন মৌলিক অনুমান বা অ্যাজাম্পশনগুলো কাজ করছে সেগুলোকে চিহ্নিত করা, মানে খুঁজে বের করা।
ওকে, তারপর?
এরপর সেগুলোকে একটু প্রশ্ন করা, এগুলো কি আসলেই সব জায়গায় খাটে, সবসময় সত্যি, নাকি বিশেষ পরিস্থিতিতেই এগুলো কাজ করে। তারপর চেষ্টা করা একেবারে নতুন বিকল্প কোনো অনুমান দাঁড় করানোর, যা হয়তো প্রচলিত ধারণার থেকে বেশ আলাদা, এমনকি উল্টো হতে পারে।
আচ্ছা, মানে অল্টারনেটিভ তৈরি করা।
হ্যাঁ, আর অবশ্যই ভাবতে হবে এই নতুন ধারণাটা কি বিশ্বাসযোগ্য হবে, নাকি একেবারে অবাস্তব শোনাবে। কারণ লক্ষ্য তো শুধু সমালোচনা করা নয়, বরং এমন প্রশ্ন তৈরি করা যা নতুন আলোচনার জন্ম দিতে পারে, ইন্টারেস্টিং প্রশ্ন তৈরি করা।
কিন্তু এটা তো বেশ কঠিন মনে হচ্ছে, আর ঝুঁকিপূর্ণ তো।
অবশ্যই, এই পথটা কিন্তু ঝুঁকিপূর্ণ, কারণ প্রতিষ্ঠিত ধারণা চ্যালেঞ্জ করলে অনেক সময় প্রতিরোধ আসে, এটা সহজ নয়।
তাহলে এর আসল গুরুত্বটা কোথায়? এটা কি শুধু একাডেমিক জগতের জন্যে?
না না, এখানেই তো মজাটা। এই যে কোনো বিষয়ের গভীরে গিয়ে তার মূল অনুমানকে প্রশ্ন করার ক্ষমতা, এটা কিন্তু শুধু গবেষকদের জন্য নয়।
তাই নাকি?
হ্যাঁ, ব্যবসা, প্রযুক্তি, শিল্পকলা, এমনকি আমাদের দৈনন্দিন জীবনেও এর বিশাল প্রাসঙ্গিকতা আছে। যখন আমরা প্রশ্ন করি, আচ্ছা, এটা এভাবেই কেন করতে হবে, অন্য কোনো উপায় নেই, তখনই কিন্তু ইনোভেশনের রাস্তা খোলে।
ঠিক।
বড় বড় ব্যবসায়িক পরিবর্তন বা টেকনোলজিক্যাল ইনোভেশন অনেক সময় কিন্তু এই ধরনের মৌলিক প্রশ্ন থেকে এসেছে। মানে কেউ একজন প্রচলিত জাম্পশনটাকে চ্যালেঞ্জ করেছে। এটা শুধু তথ্য যোগ করে না, পুরো খেলার নিয়মই বদলে দিতে পারে।
বাহ, দারুণ পয়েন্ট। তাহলে সংক্ষেপে যদি বলি, গ্যাপ স্পটিং হলো জ্ঞানের ইমারতে নতুন ইট যোগ করার মতো দরকারি, কিন্তু
হ্যাঁ, দরকারি তো বটেই, ছোট ছোট উন্নতির জন্য অপরিহার্য।
আর প্রবলেমাটাইজেশন হলো সেই ইমারতের নকশাটাকেই প্রশ্ন করা, আচ্ছা, এটা কি অন্যভাবে বানানো যেত না, বা এই ইমারতের দরকারটাই বা কি?
একদম, খুব ভালো বলেছেন। দুটো পদ্ধতিরই নিজস্ব ভূমিকা আছে। জ্ঞানকে পরিমার্জিত করার জন্য গ্যাপ স্পটিং দরকার, কিন্তু যদি সত্যি বড় মাপের পরিবর্তন আনতে হয়, নতুন দিগন্ত খুলতে হয়, হ্যাঁ, তাহলে এই অন্তর্নিহিত অনুমানগুলোকে চ্যালেঞ্জ করার সাহস দেখাতে হবে। ঝুঁকি আছে, মানছি, কিন্তু এর পুরস্কারও অনেক বড় হতে পারে, মানে একেবারে নতুন পথ খুলে যাওয়ার সম্ভাবনা থাকে।
আজকের আলোচনা থেকে একটা বিষয় খুব পরিষ্কার হলো আমার কাছে, নতুন কিছু জানার বা তৈরি করার জন্য শুধু তথ্য সংগ্রহ করাটাই সব নয়, তার চেয়েও বেশি দরকার হয়তো প্রশ্ন করার মানসিকতা।
ঠিক, প্রশ্ন করা, কেন, কিভাবে, অন্যভাবে হতে পারে না।
এই যে আমাদের চারপাশে কত ধারণা আছে যা আমরা প্রায় সকলে বিনা প্রশ্নে মেনে নিই, তাই না? কত সাধারণ জ্ঞান যা আসলে হয়তো প্রশ্নবিদ্ধ হতে পারে।
হতেই পারে।
তো শ্রোতাদের জন্য একটা ভাবনার খোরাক রেখে যাই, আমাদের পরিচিত কাজের ক্ষেত্র বা ব্যক্তিগত জীবনে এমন কোনো মৌলিক অনুমান কি লুকিয়ে আছে যাকে চ্যালেঞ্জ করলে হয়তো অভাবনীয় কোনো নতুন দিক খুলে যেতে পারে? একটু অন্যভাবে চিন্তা করলে কি হতে পারে?
দারুণ একটা প্রশ্ন, ভাবার মতো।